As promised, lawyer and foreign policy analyst Mark Brzezinski is here for more. Mark, good to see you. Thanks so much for being here. So,
thank you for having me, Dina.
Let's get right into it.
Yeah.
At this point, is there any alternative to Mubarak? And if so, what is it?
Well, there's an alternative in the form of the coalition that's forming around el-Baradei. But much more broadly, there is an alternative in terms of choices in the Middle East. You see two other countries in the Middle East that have gone through transitions, historically important countries. One is Turkey, the other is Iran. In Turkey, you had the army transition the country and become a guardian of democracy. In Iran, you had the toppling of the Shah and a transition to a fundamentalist theocracy. Those are the choices that you're facing in Egypt right now. But right now you see the army making a declaration that they're not going to fire on the people. This is a broad-based social upheaval. Farmers, students, business people, regular people, and the army has said they're not going to fire on the people. That's an important signal to the Mubarak government.
But would the U.S. ever support a populist movement? For example, if those people, those farmers, those teachers, those students, like you say, decide we want the Muslim Brotherhood,
right,
what would the U.S. reaction be to that?
Well, the U.S. reaction would not support the emergence of a Muslim Brotherhood government.
Even if they were democratically elected, right? In
Egypt. And that's why I think that they're trying to provide advice to the Mubarak government that there is a right way and a wrong way to handle this. I think it's pretty clear, Dina, that the Mubarak government has to go. But go in what way? To continue to stumble along when in a few months an even more aggressive popular uprising might occur and topple the government, and then we won't know the results of it, and it could be a Muslim Brotherhood type government.
Which the U.S. would not accept.
Which the U.S. would not want. Or it could be a transition according to the Constitution of Egypt, the existing Constitution. When the vice president takes over, there's 2 months until a general election, and the Council of Opposition Political Party leaders that are forming around Mubarak could help ease the way to that popular election.
Do you subscribe to the theory then, given everything that you just said, that what is good for the United States is good for the world? Because that's where this whole issue of democratically elected governments comes in, right? Because a lot of people bring up the situation in Hamas and say the Bush administration did a 180 when the people chose Hamas. So is, again, whatever is good for the United States is good for the world?
Well, I don't think that's the right way to look at what's happening in Egypt or Tunisia. I think in certain ways what happened in Tunisia precipitated what happened in Egypt. The Tunisians were successful and were gutsy, and the Egyptians were in certain ways inspired to do the same thing. Why were the Tunisians and Egyptians on the street? It, of course, is about popular rule, separation of powers, and decentralization of power. But it was also a reaction against mafia-style government in both countries, in which the government and its economy are really run and benefiting a few families. What I'm talking about right now is endemic corruption. The Egyptians want to be able to participate in their own country, economically and politically, and that's what they're seeking to do. This is not something about, what the Americans want or something like that. I think, quite frankly, that's very marginal to what's happening in Egypt.
Well, you say that there's sort of this mafia-style government, and a lot of experts have been saying that U.S. policy has been schizophrenic when it comes to that, even what we've been hearing out of the State Department. So up until now, then, we can assume that the United States did support this, as you say, mafia-style government.
Well, the American foreign policy is rife with examples, including, for example, of Pakistan, where we have embraced and then pushed away the government 30 different ways over the last 30 years. That's why the Paks only trust us so much in terms of what we say. So what we have to do is come up with a strategy that seeks in the short term to create a result that is good for the Egyptian people, but in the long term is consistent, because that will give our relationship credibility in the eyes of the people in the region. Because what we're seeing, 50% of the population of Egypt is under the age of 25. That generation of people is inspired, mobilized.
And so many unemployed, let's not forget that.
Exactly, and unable to participate in their economy. That's the generation of people that's demanding change in a way that is now, I think, shared in certain ways between Yemen, Tunisia, Egypt, and elsewhere.
I just wanted to get your take on this. Congressman Ron Paul recently came out and said that the U.S. should just stop meddling in all of these affairs, and he said, more importantly, stop the aid to Israel, let them just sort everything out. What do you think about that?
Well, we have to support our close friend and ally, Israel, in the Middle East. It is the only genuine democracy in the Middle East, and it is a spearhead of modernization and change in a way that we support in the Middle East. At the same time, if what Congressman Paul is saying is that we need to stop meddling in terms of participating on the margins in societies that could be counterproductive to the American interest, I don't disagree with that.
He's saying just stop all aid. Well, to Israel, to Egypt, and to other countries there. That's his take on it.
Right. Well, 2/3 of the world's population, unfortunately, lives in abject poverty, and the richest countries have incumbent on them the role of providing assistance and aid. I mean, and we saw the right way.
It always has a political overtone to it, doesn't it?
I don't think aid in the tsunami relief in Indonesia, which gave,
when we think about
garnered
Pakistan or Afghanistan, Israel, even Egypt, those are the top countries that are receiving U.S. aid.
I think assistance needs to be genuinely tied to the needs of the people and without the kind of political overlay that you're suggesting. And when that happens, it can be counterproductive to American interests. But I also feel that America is very generous around the world, and rightfully so. And when you take a look at the billions that have been transferred to places like the Middle East, like Indonesia, like Pakistan after the floods to help the people, I think that very much advances our interest. Look at the goodwill that some of those assistance programs generated. That very much helped us.
Mark, I want to get into something that your father said actually just last year that could be sort of a premonition to all this. He warned of a global awakening, saying that, you know, because of our universal access to radio, to television, to the internet, that it's going to sort of cause people to rise up, and we will see these kinds of protests. Do you think that we're sort of in the midst of this global awakening, and why is it happening now?
Well, Dina, as you might imagine, my father very much speaks for himself, and I can't comment.
It was just interesting to see what's going on, though, but then he sort of talked about this just last year at a meeting on the Council on Foreign Relations.
What I think is perhaps even more relevant in terms of what you bring up is Anne Applebaum's column in today's Washington Post, in which she said that, in fact, the role of Twitter, the role of Facebook, which have been relevant in other popular movements in Colombia, in Kenya, in Ukraine, elsewhere, has actually had a more marginal role, a tangential role in Egypt.
Because they can shut it down.
Because they did shut it down.
They did.
And I think what you see here is people seeing others on the streets and saying, we feel that it is time has said enough. You can't have just a few families ruling and benefiting and prospering in a country as vast and as historically conscious of its own roots as Egypt. This is a country with great benefits, with the possibility of great prosperity, but when you go to Cairo, you see abject poverty. You go to the Muhammad Ali Mosque on the hill overlooking Cairo, you see poverty that you just don't see in the Western world. That has to change, and that's why you see particularly so many young people on the streets.
I also want to mention this point. The Daily Telegraph had an article that basically said that the American government was secretly backing some of these leading figures in Egypt's uprising. This was also mentioned or revealed by the WikiLeaks cables as well. Why would the United States do this? I mean, isn't this sort of a bad thing for the United States, all this instability? I mean, why would they have these people for something like 3 years? Where they were sort of harboring them here, then they went back to Egypt, so they sort of knew about this, that this was coming.
Well, you know, Dina, I don't know the accuracy of the WikiLeaks leaks, first of all. Some of them have been shown to be completely phony. But it's obvious that the U.S., over the last couple of years, has been supporting freedom of expression, independent newspapers, the right of some groups to women's groups to mobilize students' groups and so forth. The American University in Cairo is a oasis of free expression, and it gets a lot of support from America. And that's all to the good. And so I think that it's been very clear where we wanted the direction of reform to go in Egypt. by us supporting these groups.
But they were sort of, the U.S. was also at this time publicly praising Mubarak. And that's where I think people take issue with that, because they say, okay, on the one hand, you're publicly praising Mubarak. On the other hand, you have these activists here that you know are going to wreak havoc in 1 or 2 years.
Well, I mean, look, I mean, it's just like we were talking about before. America has embraced and pushed away its allies and its partners in the Middle East and elsewhere in the international scene for years and years. What you're describing is inconsistent, and I agree. And I think that it's a heads up to American foreign policy analysts and others that change is in the air in the Middle East. And be careful who you embrace. At the same time, be careful as to what's behind door number 2. Because you don't, as you were talking about earlier, you don't necessarily want to create a situation where the Muslim Brotherhood can gain traction and power in a place like Egypt.
We're certainly going to be monitoring the situation very closely. We got to go for now, but thank you so much for being here, for your analysis. Foreign policy analyst Mark Brzezinski, thanks.
Thank you for having me.